Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're going to get underway here. Have a nice prompt start. We've got a packed agenda for you this morning, so we're going to get down to it. My name is Dave Ramsley. I am principal with the Integral Group, and we are the consultant team that is supporting both the province of Ontario and the City of Toronto in this energy reporting and benchmarking initiative. So we feel fortunate to be working for such great clients on this. So you'll hear from me a bit today, just initially, and then later when we're doing our Q&A session, and also my colleague Rachel Mosevich, who will be introducing our speakers today. So thank you very much for coming. And for those of you who are listening online at home, I think we have about 15 or 20 participants that are also watching across the country via WebEx today. I also should warn you that we're also filming this on video, so just, you know, be warned, keep it clean. This is going to be recorded for posterity. You know, benchmarking can be a very passionate subject, right? So we can all get really excited. So we're working on behalf of both the province and the city, as I mentioned, to do some stakeholder engagement. So this is just one of the tasks that we're doing, including having some one-on-one meetings with stakeholders. We will also be working with both parties on some upcoming policy workshops in 2 weeks, which you'll hear more about in just a few moments. But the reason why we're here today is that both these jurisdictions, the province of Ontario and the City of Toronto, are exploring options for mandatory energy reporting and benchmarking requirements for large commercial buildings and potentially multi-unit residential buildings. This, of course, is where owners will be required to report annually on a building's energy and greenhouse gas emissions and their water consumption. Just as a bit of a primer for those of you who may be new to this area, energy reporting and benchmarking really has, you know, three distinct parts. First is benchmarking and energy, the energy use and water consumption to compare against other buildings. The second is reporting that data to the city and the province. And then the third is by what manner will we be sharing that data with the general public, and by what mechanisms. So ERB, which we call, which is short for energy reporting and benchmarking, because, you know, I can say this as a former bureaucrat, you know, you can't really have a program or a policy without shortening it to an acronym, right? So ERB is what we're calling energy reporting and benchmarking. Would provide both the province and the city with a clearer picture on how buildings use energy, what categories of buildings offer the most opportunity for improvement. And this information could be used to better target incentives and retrofit initiatives towards areas with greatest potential for savings. The province and the city are working together to jointly consult with stakeholders on the potential for mandatory commercial energy reporting and benchmarking. However, should the province decide to proceed with the regulation, the city would reevaluate the need to continue with its efforts in developing a bylaw. Building owners and managers would not be subject to any duplicate reporting requirements. I just want to say, as a former city employee as well, too, I really applaud both of our clients for working together. I've never personally seen a joint initiative of this sort between both the province and the city, so it's really great to see. So just some overview of some timelines of where we're going with this. So some upcoming events. The policy workshops I noted on are coming up on April 9th, 8th, 9th, and 14th. People are encouraged to sign up for the e-updates to keep up to date with the project milestones and further opportunities. So you can, again, find out about those policy workshops through the e-updates. And we'll work out over the course of the day. We'll have those posted up on the screen for you to find out how to get a hold of them. I also just want to take a moment just to also recognize our two project managers on behalf of both the city and the province. So if you see them around today and want to connect with them directly, have some specific questions. So that's Marco Ocampo. Just Marco, raise your hand over here. He's with the City of Toronto. And Candace Major at the back, working with the Province of Ontario Ministry of Energy. And then finally, we'd just like to thank BOMA for supporting and sponsoring this event this morning. We've invited BOMA to provide some concluding remarks and some thoughts on how the initiative went at the end of the day today. So just again, thank you for BOMA. Think of them when you're enjoying that warm cup of coffee or the fantastic baked goods or lunch we're going to enjoy this afternoon. The agenda for today is we're going to hear from a collection of speakers, which we're fortunate to have come from many jurisdictions from the United States and here both locally in Ontario. And our partners to the south, we're going to hear from jurisdictions that already have energy benchmarking reporting initiatives. And so what's worked there and where what advice can they provide to both the City of Toronto and the Province of Ontario moving forward. And then we'll also hear from some local examples like CivicAction, which have used energy benchmarking and data to great effect. And then the second half of the morning will be for a Q&A session. So we'll have a moderated panel, and this will be your opportunity to actually engage with these experts and get some real insight. We will also be walking the technological tightrope this morning as well too. We'll be experimenting with an online mobile phone based feedback where you guys can be able to provide and answer some questions. We'll let you know a little bit more about that in a second. But before to formally open this session today, I would just like to first invite an official welcoming on behalf of both the City of Toronto and the Province of Ontario. But first, through Jim Baxter and Kylie Surmet-Harding. But I would just invite maybe Jim to come up to the podium here for a moment. Jim's the Director of Environment and Energy with Division with the City of Toronto. So, Jim Baxter.
Thank you very much. When I was talking to Marco about this presentation, he said, Jim, keep it short. So I'm going to try to do that. Anyway, my purpose here today is just to thank everybody for coming. I stand up here and I look out and it's a full house. That is wonderful. I think we're all encouraged by this. I think that as we look at energy reporting and benchmarking, it's part of a larger climate change impetus that's really starting to grow and gain momentum. And I think the fact that we're all here in this room today speaks well for that. I think we're in good hands. I wanted to thank the province for partnering with this, and I think it's about time that the city and the province started to work on initiatives of common interest together. And I hope that this is the first of many collaborations, because I think as we work in ever more challenging times, we don't have the luxury of duplication. And I think that working together on an initiative like this is a really great start. I also wanted to thank BOMA. BOMA is a key partner in this and a key sponsor for today. So the hospitality, the coffee, the facilities, we owe a vote of thanks to BOMA for that. And I think it also speaks well to the fact that the industry is part of the process. And we're really good to that. A little bit about the city. So the city has set emissions targets, 6% by 2012, which we've met and surpassed compared to 1990. We have a 30% reduction by 2020, which we think we're well on the way to accomplishing. But the big one is this 80% reduction in carbon by 2050. It's 35 years away. And we believe that we're not going to get there through incremental means. We're going to have to look at initiatives that are transformational in nature. We have to make some pretty difficult decisions, because I think we have to look at behavioral change down the road. It's not just a matter of tweaking kilowatt-hour consumption down here or there. These are big, hairy goals, and we have to hit them head on, because if we don't, we're not going to make any great progress, and the goal in 35 years will not be met. And I think everybody, what we've been hearing in our research is everybody's prepared to work on this goal, but what they're looking for is ideas on what to do, and what can we do to work towards that kind of a reduction goal. One of those things is energy reporting and benchmarking. I think it's very hard to manage what you can't or what you don't measure. And I think the better information we have, the better decisions we will be able to make. Within the City of Toronto, this is not a new, like the whole idea of energy reduction is not new. We've been working on climate change and energy management for quite a while. The Better Buildings Partnership has been underway now for 25 years, I would think, the early 1990s. We have the Toronto Green Standard for new construction within the City of Toronto. We've got the Home Energy Loan Program. We launched that last year to use local improvement charges for residential energy retrofits, and that is starting to really gain momentum. Some of the newer things that we're working on is the whole idea of community energy planning. The building code, the green standard, those are really great tools, but they're building specific. Community energy planning looks at areas or neighborhoods, and the idea is that by grouping buildings together into areas or neighborhoods, we can do better. and our efforts have been recognized. When you look globally, I think the Grosvenor Institute identified Toronto as the most resilient city in the world. We're also the 4th most livable city. We're number 4. So we still have a ways to go. I think that's the point. I think that even though we're doing very well, we had 3 heat and weather-related events in 2013. We had a summer storm, we had a heat wave the week following, and we had an ice storm. So the whole idea of climate change and its impact on cities and resilience is really here now. And a lot of that can be tied back to energy consumption in buildings. So that's why we're here today. So I'm going to leave it with that. I just want to say that we've got a great program that's been put on today. And I think we're really proud of of the program. I think we've got some great speakers. This is your day. Participate, please participate, contribute, and we'll move the sticks forward. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you all for coming and spending the morning with us, and we look forward to great conversations.
And Kylie, would you like to come up and say some words on behalf of the Province of Ontario? So Kylie is the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Energy with the Province of Ontario. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. And I guess, like both Dave and Jim have said, we're really thrilled at the level of interest and the turnout at our summit this morning. It's really exciting to see, and certainly looking forward to a really constructive and informative discussion this morning. So on behalf of the Province of Ontario, I would like to thank you for attending today's summit, and to echo Jim's comments, would also like to thank in particular BOMA Toronto for sponsoring the summit. So my comments, I thought, might just focus on some of the broader context and how this particular initiative that we're exploring fits into Ontario's broader conservation-related goals. In its 2013 long-term energy plan, Ontario committed to putting conservation first before building new generation, transmission and distribution infrastructure where cost-effective. As we plan for Ontario's energy needs for the next 20 years, conservation will be the first resource considered. It's one of the cleanest and most cost-effective energy resources and offers consumers a means to reduce and manage their energy bills. The province has also established a long-term electricity conservation target of 30 terawatt-hours in 2032, and is also committed to promoting the conservation of natural gas and other fuel types. In collaboration with its agencies and partners, the province is working on a number of new conservation initiatives to achieve its objectives, and I'd like to just maybe highlight a few of those. Commercial energy reporting and benchmarking for large buildings is, of course, one of these initiatives. In the province's Conservation First white paper that was released in 2013 and led to the development of the long-term energy plan, rating systems for buildings and benchmarking was noted as an initiative that could allow consumers to benchmark the relative energy efficiency of various properties and inform their investment decisions. Ontario's government-owned facilities and broader public sector organizations, including the City of Toronto, are already showing leadership by annually reporting their energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions and developing 5-year energy conservation and demand management plans. To build on the success of these initiatives, the province and the city, as we know, today are jointly consulting on the possibility of requiring large commercial and potentially multi-unit residential buildings to annually report their energy and water consumption and greenhouse gas emissions and develop 5-year energy conservation and demand management plans. Some of the other initiatives that the province is working on includes, at the beginning of this year, Ontario launched new 6-year electricity and natural gas conservation frameworks that will support the delivery of province-wide and local conservation programs. These frameworks will go a long way in helping the province achieve its conservation goals, including enabling greater collaboration and coordination of conservation efforts across Ontario's electricity and gas utilities. Ontario has also committed to regularly updating its energy efficiency standards regulation. We currently regulate the energy efficiency of over 80 products in the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, and that represents more products than any other jurisdiction in Canada, including NRCan. This includes having the most stringent efficiency requirements for a number of products, such as residential appliances, lighting products, and some HVAC and water heating products. By bringing forward minimum efficiency requirements for products and equipment used in commercial buildings, particularly lighting, cooling, and ventilation, we can continue to drive significant savings opportunities for building owners and building tenants. Ontario currently has energy efficiency requirements for more than 30 products found in typical commercial buildings. Which brings me back to this morning's event. We have a number of experts in the field with us that have kindly agreed to share their knowledge and expertise and insights on mandatory and voluntary energy reporting and benchmarking initiatives for large buildings in both Canada and the United States. And we hope that hearing from them will provide you with a better understanding of the policy landscape which the province and the city are exploring. And we certainly encourage you to ask as many questions as you like during the panel discussion, which will follow, I guess, after the break. And we hope the discussion will inform you with any ongoing input that you may want to bring forward as part of the consultation process. So thank you again for taking the time to attend and participate. And again, we look forward to a very constructive and interesting discussion.
All right. So thanks very much. Is it moving? Wow. There you go. Okay, great. All right. So this is our agenda for this morning. So we're going to have our presenters come up. They're going to present for about 15 minutes each. And then after which we'll be able to entertain some questions at the end. And then we're going to take a brief break. And then you'll have a chance to more deeply engage with the panel after that. So we're going to hear a little bit about, first of all, we're going to go with New York City, then down to what is it, Boston first, and then, anyway, I'll let Rachel handle that one. But what we're going to do is, that's the agenda. We've got a way which we'd like to engage with the audience today, not only just people online who can pose questions, but while we are between breaks, we're also going to be testing your knowledge about energy reporting and benchmarking and all things energy related. Interesting anecdote this morning, just a quick check of Twitter. Anecdotally, it seems like the environmental spill that happened in the TCC this morning may have been an oil spill. So the conservation of energy and resources could have the unforeseen benefit of reducing our need on fossil fuels and therefore increasing transit reliability. So, and allowing you to get to a meeting on time. So let's hope we're successful. So we're going to do this via smartphones. So I hope that you have a smartphone. A recent Industry Canada poll also indicated that there was more smartphones operating in Canada than people operating in Canada. So, so hopefully you have at least one, or if you have two, you can participate with two if you like. So if you have a smartphone, please take it out right now. What we have is if you can't get reception in here, you can go to, you can open your settings and go to the Wi-Fi. Our Wi-Fi is Mars Open Internet. There is no password, so you should be able to access it there. And then if you open your web browser and go to polev.com/summit ERB, all one word. All right? You should hear the mad tapping of fingers on screens. Anyone having any problems? And so what we'll be able to do here going to work. This is always the most exciting part of every presentation, to see if your video works or your real-time Wi-Fi engaged polling. Download, take tour. Why is this happening? One moment. Video is really good if the presenter could not only make the Is this going to work here? We may have to abandon this. Hold on one second. Why is this not? I think it's going to go. Take two of my polls. Is this going to work? Okay. All right. So how's everyone doing with the, oh, why is this not showing up now? Is this not showing up on the
Do
slide?
you want to see that? You want
Yes.
to put it down on the screen? Yeah.
Why is it not working?
Say about.
Allow.
Okay. And
What's your question? Oh, it popped up? Got a question? There we go. Okay.
But not on the
Oh, it's not on the screen for some reason.
we'll manage. All right. So here. Ah. Shit. You want to do that?
You just have to switch between.
Yeah, I have to switch between the
Okay,
screens.
so maybe we won't bother with this later on then.
Yeah. I just need to move it. Should come here and
Is it working? Yeah, I think we might need to abort here.
give 1 sec, 1 sec. And
Didn't show up there.
it
I
should
think
be.
what usually it does.
It should be.
Oh
It
well.
should be. It should be because it's what,
happening.
It's what people see on the screen.
They just can't see it.
They just can't see it on this. Oh well. We're seeing the results of your polls up here on this screen. We just can't get it on this screen, but I can assure you it looks marvelous on this screen right here. Sure.
Yeah.
It is poll EV, all one word,
Hey.
/ there it is. So it's up here in this corner here,
/
poll EV.
ER, Summit ERV.
Yeah. So there we go, results in real time. The problem we have here, I think, is the interface between the PowerPoint, the WebEx, and the online web tool. So it's always dangerous to use one web plugin when you're doing a presentation, but we decided to use 3 because we just decided to make it really difficult on ourselves. So that's the feedback of who we have in the room today. So we can see that we have lots of government, a healthy government contingent in the room today. Building owners, oh, the consultants are coming on strong there with 23%. Industry representatives, utilities, and no academia. Oh, academia, just not logged on yet. That's all right, no problem. And then other, okay. All right, well, we'll be trying to do this. We'll see if we maybe do this again, if we have to do this split screen thing. So can I maybe get a hand to get the PowerPoint back?
Right. This one?
Yeah, perfect, okay. Want to take it away? Rachel, take it away?
Just click.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rachel Moskovich, also with Integral Group. Thank you all for coming. I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers for today. We're not doing that again. Ah. I do need your help.
I'm gonna stay here. It's gonna be easier. This one? Is it this one you want?
I can continue, actually. So we have a great group this morning. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone. Our first speaker this morning will be Ross MacWhinney. Ross is a policy advisor for New York City's Greener, Greater Buildings Plan. He is also an employee of the Institute for Market Transformation, which you'll hear more about in his presentation, and he works full-time in the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability. Ross assists the office in developing legislative modifications and expansions of existing policies to increase the scope of buildings affected by the Greener, Greater Buildings Plan. Ross also assists with analytical projects such as the city's annual benchmarking report and the city's analysis of energy audit data.
Is this one you want? Okay. This is what you want to see.
No.
This one? So, there's something to ask.
Great, okay, so, hi everybody, thanks for having me. This works, right? Oh wait, what happened to my slide? There we go. Right, so yeah, thanks for having me. Again, I'm Ross MacWhinney here from the Mayor's Office of Sustainability in New York, but also an employee embedded there by the Institute for Market Transformation. And I'd just like to thank the city, the province, BOMA, and Integral for having me, and very interested to see the progress and hear more about what Toronto's doing as well. I've been asked to talk kind of half about what IMT works on in energy efficiency throughout the United States, as well as some of the work that New York City has done, and particularly with regard to benchmarking, where it's been really one of the leaders in this area. So for folks who are not maybe so familiar with the Institute for Market Transformation, it's a really great DC-based nonprofit that promotes energy efficiency and green building policies throughout the United States and abroad. It serves as a center of best practices for the design, the adoption, and the implementation of energy efficiency policies, primarily in cities, although it also acts as a policy advisor to governments on the local, state, and federal levels. But I'd say that the largest chunk of IMT's experience comes from hands-on work with cities across the country to help them implement effective energy efficiency policies. And part of that is through embedded employees like myself in New York, but in the whole host of other cities that they're working in. So I think Toronto's realized this, but as cities have developed, increasingly developing greenhouse gas inventories, it's become clear that buildings are often the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in a city. And so this means that similarly, they're the largest opportunity often to make greenhouse gas emission reductions. I think it's particularly the case in cities with strong mass transit systems. So you see here each of these four cities, the strongest mass transit systems in the US, the building sector accounts for over 70% of the emissions from each of those cities. However, I think it's also interesting to note that even cities in the US that aren't known for their mass transit have pretty large building, or rather their greenhouse gas emissions are represented to a large extent by their building segment. So Dallas, 51% of their emissions come from buildings, Minneapolis 65%, Philadelphia 62%, and Salt Lake City 75%. And so I'd say that IMT views benchmarking not really as a solution in and of itself, but more as a foundation that can facilitate other energy efficiency policies and allow a city to understand what the impacts of their policies and what the effectiveness of their policies are. And so this map shows benchmarking policies in cities and states throughout the U.S. I'd say, I should probably correct this, the New York City policy includes public buildings as well. And then a closer look at the city level policies. I think the newest on this list is Cambridge, who I believe just had their first benchmarking deadline in December. I guess actually 4 of these 10 cities reported for the first time in the last year. So I think there's some good momentum there. I think some other interesting points are that New York City, San Francisco, and Austin each have energy audit components in addition to their benchmarking policies. New York City also has a lighting upgrade and sub-metering requirement for their non-residential buildings, I think over 50,000 square feet. And then also particularly of interest to me is Chicago's focus on the verification of benchmarking data, which I think addresses an important issue around data quality, and I'm very interested to hear more about that, hopefully today. So, you know, with the current batch of policies in place, it represents about 51,000 properties, a lot of those in New York and in California. These policies are typically designed to capture the largest buildings. So, and New York City has a lot of those large buildings, accounting for about 2.8 billion square feet of total benchmarked property. So yeah, pretty big component there. And so each of these city policies rely, to my knowledge, on the EPA Portfolio Manager tool to report the benchmarking data. EPA isn't really an advocate for designing benchmarking policies, but they provide really, I'd say, essential technical support to each of these cities and states. So I think this slide is interesting in that it shows that there's a relationship that's been observed between benchmarking buildings and energy efficiency. So you'll see energy use intensity declining and Energy Star score increasing. But I think that it's difficult, if not impossible, to draw a causal relationship directly from benchmarking to energy efficiency. I think really instead, the way IMT thinks about it is that benchmarking is really the foundation. It's about getting access to information in order to drive the market further for energy efficiency. And it's something that you can layer other energy efficiency policies on top of. So maybe energy auditing, retro-commissioning, certification of building operators, things that make sense in your city. I think basically once you have benchmarking in place, you can then say for a particular building or a group of buildings, if you've observed some change over time in their energy performance, have they gone through energy audits? What energy conservation measures are common in these buildings? When was the last time they were retro-commissioned? So really without the benchmarking component, it's very difficult, I think, to assess the effectiveness of your other energy efficiency policies. And so a large part of IMT's work is through the City Energy Project, where they work with the NRDC in each of these 10 cities to help them develop effective policies around energy efficiency. I think it's really on a city-by-city basis in terms of what's viable from a political standpoint and what makes just most sense in those areas. These were selected partially because of their size and that they're kind of dispersed around the country. I think part of the effect here is that there are many large real estate companies with properties or portfolios that extend across cities. For these companies, when their properties fall into a city with policies that require benchmarking or other energy efficiency policies, they will often bring those processes up into their larger process, which can then have impacts on cities outside of the boundaries of benchmarked cities. So maybe a a company with buildings in Atlanta then starts to benchmark and then basically turns that around and does the same thing in their properties maybe in Miami or somewhere else. So just a larger effect than just outside or within the boundaries of the cities themselves. And so IMT works here through embedded employees, similar to my situation in New York, providing best practice kind of advisory services, and a lot of that coming from the work they've done with cities like New York. And so I'd say a really key component here is the role of utilities. The utility is there and can offer kind of two things. One is access to energy and water data for building owners. The other is the ability to upload it automatically to Portfolio Manager. And in New York, we have access, but we don't have automatic uploads. And I'd say that automatic uploads really go a long way in making it easier for the building owners themselves, as well as preserving or helping to maintain data quality. I mean, it basically takes the opportunity for human error out of the equation to a larger extent. And in New York, I think we may, we're paying about $102.50 for Con Edison utility records, and I'm not sure if there are too many other situations where a charge is assessed. So that brings us to deeper into the New York City program. So New York City first rolled out its energy efficiency program under Mayor Bloomberg and his Plan YC program. It was under the 30% reduction by 2025 commitment. Mayor de Blasio has since extended that to the 80% by 2050 commitment, which is currently being planned. And I think a lot of similar observations. That's going to take some big steps, maybe not just an iterative process to reach those goals, is along the same lines of what's being thought in New York. But I'd say that the trajectory that we're on under Plan YC to reach 30% by 2025 will put us in a good position to, take on that challenge. So in New York City, the energy efficiency programs are kind of composed of three elements: the Greener Greater Buildings Plan, where the benchmarking program sits, along with energy auditing, retrocommissioning, lighting upgrades, and submetering; the Green Codes Task Force; and the voluntary Mayor's Carbon Challenge, which involves universities and hospitals primarily committing to voluntary reductions. So getting more into the benchmarking component, basically our law is under, it's Local Law 84. It requires buildings over 50,000 square feet to report energy and water consumption through Portfolio Manager annually. This yields a data set of about 13,000 buildings. And actually that number could probably be modified to include the public buildings, but in terms of the private sector, it's 13,000 buildings. We use this data set a lot for our analysis, for our benchmarking report. We share it with some research partners at NYU, University of Pennsylvania, Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, and a few others. We also so the data set that we get has 256 columns, so we truncate that to kind of maintain privacy, and then we post that to the public to allow further analysis of that data set. And so we've published reports each of the last 3 years on our benchmarking and the progress and some of the analysis that we benefit from our research partners. Part of that analysis is on our compliance, which has grown over the years. You see it here broken down by multifamily and office, which are our largest building types. I think one key point here is that compliance in New York, as well as almost every other city that I know of, maybe save Chicago, means submitting a report through Portfolio Manager, and it doesn't get into the accuracy or other elements of the data in the report itself. And I think that that's an interesting area that has opportunities for improvement. So another thing that we get kind of through this analysis is the ability to look at energy use intensity mapped across the city. This is for office buildings, and this is for multifamily, which is our largest building type. And so, it's interesting at this point you can start asking yourself, why is energy use intensity so high in Hell's Kitchen or Wall Street or in Brownsville, Brooklyn, or in Jamaica? And we're not really sure, but at least we can start answering or asking the question. I mean, one concept might be that there are a lot of public housing in Brownsville and in Jamaica, which is certainly the case. That doesn't really explain Wall Street. Potentially, maybe there it's related to the age of those buildings, the decade in which they were built, which we've found also is kind of can describe or predict to a degree the energy efficiency. So we found that newer buildings were less efficient on average than older buildings, and we're able to kind of chart this by decade that they were built in. Also, we've been able to kind of analyze the distribution of energy use intensity. So you see here our multifamily buildings, tighter range, lower EUI overall, a little more predictable. And then you look at office buildings, you have kind of a higher EUI potential. Maybe that comes from data centers potentially. I think we're still kind of looking into what's behind that. I'd say another kind of thing that we're able to do with the data is look at, who are the poorest performers, and can we then devise policy that will address that segment without kind of burdening the other groups of buildings in the city, and have a more targeted effect, when we maybe through energy audit or some other process. So I'd say that benchmarking really shows its value in that it allows you to look at your building stock in a lot of different ways and start thinking about how you can cut emissions further. And then finally, I just wanted to include this here because I think it's probably an important consideration for Toronto and Ontario at this point that benchmarking is very useful, but that the government can be complex, and designing your compliance and your internal systems in a simple way can really help. Our system, I think we're looking to improve on it. It works and it's good, but I think that it can certainly improve. I think this shows, so data coming from portfolio manager comes to the Office of Sustainability currently, which goes to the Department of Finance, which kind of checks against a compliance list. That compliance list then goes to the Department of Buildings, which issues fines. A separate list goes to our IT department, which kind of helps us with publishing a public data set. And I think that a lot of hands are involved and can therefore introduce potential for error along the way. So I just want to kind of end on this because I think it's an important consideration that basically if you can keep it simple, it will really help you in the effectiveness of your policy. And that does it for me. Thank you, and I guess we'll have questions later.
Thank you, Ross. Once again, we ask you to hold your questions to the Q&A session at the end. Next up, one of our local speakers, Brad Henderson. Brad serves as volunteer vice chair of CivicAction's Race to Reduce and is a volunteer member of the Municipal Performance Committee of the Toronto Regional Board of Trade. Brad began his career in commercial real estate and has held senior executive roles at CBRE and Royal LePage, now Cushman & Wakefield. He has also enjoyed successful ventures in technology, having held executive roles at TELUS, Gibraltar Solutions, and Arcana Technologies. Brad, please come up.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me, and in particular CivicAction today, to share with you that story. As I was thinking about what I would say and the amount of time I had, I was reminded of a story of a preacher who would travel to remote areas in the country and try and spread the word of the gospel. And so what he would typically do, he would go into a town, he would post posters on the various light posts and walls around town. He would rent a hall, and he would go to the hall at night ready to deliver his sermon. One particular town he was in did this same process, arrives at the hall, and there's only one person there to hear the sermon. So he goes up to the person, he says, you know, hello, how are you? What do you do? And he says, well, I'm a sheep farmer, and I'm here to hear your message. He goes, well, you know, I was really expecting a lot more people, and so I was thinking, you know, I probably wouldn't do it. And the guy goes, well, look, I don't know much about sermons, but I'm a sheep farmer, and every day I feed my sheep, and if only one sheep showed up to eat, I would feed that sheep. So the preacher says, well, you know, I guess I better go ahead with it. So he proceeds to give a 2.5-hour dissertation, barn-burning speech, just delivering everything he can, all of the value he can add to this one individual. And at the end of it, he goes up to him and he says, well, what did you think of that? He says, well, I don't know much about sermons. I'm a sheep farmer. But I tell you, if one sheep showed up, I wouldn't try and force feed them the whole load. So today I'm going to share with you some of the things that we've experienced, but by no means is it the full load. I want to recognize a number of my colleagues from CivicAction, and particularly the volunteers in the room, because this is truly an incredible collaboration amongst people. So thank you very much for joining, and they will, I'm sure, correct me in anything that I get wrong, so thank you. Okay, so CivicAction is an organization, a civic organization brought together by a number of very civically minded people. And the idea was to bring together people from business, from government, from academia, from a variety of different stakeholders in the city to look at municipal problems, and particularly to look at problems where there was no form, no function, and no owner. So greening Greater Toronto ended up being one of their priority policy initiatives. And falling out of that, they said, how can we make the biggest impact in a comparatively short period of time? And it quickly came down to commercial building energy initiative. And when you look at it, 20% of greenhouse gas emissions happen within office buildings in the Greater Toronto region. Right now, there's approximately 165 million square feet, about 1,700 buildings, and that uses about 37% of the energy initiative and about 17% of natural gas consumption. So that was really what got people excited about it. The next thing was to try and rally people to the cause. And I think one of the pinnacle steps that happened is with the race to reduce, and particularly with the chair at the time, who now happens to be the mayor of the city, he was able to convince a number of major tenants to come on board to support this initiative. And of course, the major tenants are the major customers, if you like, for the major developers. So they were able to bring those developers along, and then both of them were able to bring along a whole series of service providers. So we really had a tremendous number of people that were the right people, and certainly at senior enough levels that we could actually try and get some things done. The goal was to focus on a 4-year time frame and to look at trying to reduce the amount of energy consumed in those buildings by 10%. So let's see how we're doing so far. We've still got one more reporting year, which is 2014, and we should have that data sometime in the fall of this year. But for the first 3 years of the race, we were able to sign up 195 buildings, 69 million square feet, which is approximately 42% of the office space in the Greater Toronto region. And we've been able to achieve a 7.9% energy reduction between 2010 and 2013. With $7.6 million in savings. Again, initially, I think when people got into this, they thought it was a great thing to do, but not sure whether it was going to save money or it was going to actually cost the money to do things. But what I think we're all very delighted at is that there were actually genuine savings. So some additional statistics, 108 million equivalent kilowatt hours, 12,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions, and the equivalent of taking approximately 2,700 cars off the road every year. So if you ask me and some of the other folks in the room what we think were some of the ingredients to this successful campaign, it was a couple of things. One is a very clear goal. We got everybody rallied around the 10%, and there was a lot of debate whether 10% was too much or too little, but ultimately we were able to get everyone to focus on it and to say that that actually was a meaningful goal. At 7.9, we're very confident that we're going to be able to exceed this goal with last year's reporting coming in. And so people feel very, very excited about that. I think the other thing, and we heard Ross's speech talk a lot about this too, was there's a tremendous amount of collaboration. When we first got together, I got to tell you, there was a healthy amount of skepticism amongst all of the various stakeholders to want to not only participate in this, to contribute information, ideas, and tools for the common good, but also there's a certain element of transparency when you're reporting and when you're sharing that data with your competitors and with some of the tenants that you might like to have come to your buildings. There's certainly a fear or an anxiety about doing that. But much to our delight, people got over that quite quickly because they saw the broader objective. They saw how this could contribute very significantly to the city, and specifically how it could actually improve relationships between tenants and landlords. So I don't want to characterize that the relationships were not good, but we actually saw this as a way to take those relationships to even successively higher levels. The other thing was great tools. We had some of the largest landlords, not only in Toronto, but in the world, participating in this program. And they have very significant resources that were being dedicated at energy and sustainability and energy reductions. And they were able to bring some good tools with them and share their best practices with other landlords who were maybe regional in size. We also saw a lot of the tenants, particularly the banks, the telcos, and governments, all of whom had considerable resources dedicated to these kinds of initiatives, bringing those things forward. I think one of the greatest areas that we were able to make some significant change in was to get from the low-hanging fruit, which is really a lot of the retrofits that you would do, the lighting changes, that sort of thing, to the successively higher levels of energy reduction, which really talked around tenant behavior. How do the tenants, and very specifically the employees of the tenants, behave on a daily basis? Because that can drive as much as 50% of the energy consumption, and therefore the opportunity for conservation inside of commercial office buildings. That proved to be more elusive, but I think what was very powerful in all of that was the collaboration and, as we'll talk about in a minute, the recognition that helped people to want to do more and more with that particular dimension, which was the tenant behavior. So last and not least was an awards program, recognizing the people that had achieved some great successes. And when we first conceived of the notion of an awards program, we thought, will anybody care? Will anybody submit? And will they come to a session where they're recognized in front of their peers? Well, much to our delight, and never let it be said that the landlord and tenant market and also the service provider market is not competitive. They saw this as a huge competitive opportunity. And they also saw it as an opportunity to gain recognition that can be used in their public media and in their promotions. So last year we had over 200 people attend. We had over 70 submissions for the various awards categories. And we got increasingly picked up by the press as they were recognizing this initiative. So all in all, we think that this last year is going to be a very successful year for CivicAction. We are declaring success in terms of the initiative that we set forth to achieve. We're also seeing this as something that has broader significance beyond the borders of Toronto, because most of our landlords and most of our tenants operate in markets outside of Toronto, and they didn't launch these initiatives specifically for the Toronto marketplace. They would be portfolio-wide. We're also gaining a lot of interest from other municipalities, other jurisdictions, who want to understand what we did, want to understand if that same success could be replicated in their area. And a big part of what we're leaving as a legacy from the Race to Reduce is a whole package, which basically tells you how to do it, what were the challenges that we saw along the way, what were some of the learnings that we had, and hopefully to help people move this kind of initiative in any municipality or any other jurisdiction that they want to put it forward to in a way that would have saved us a lot of time and energy. So that's it.
Well, just because I'm a glutton for punishment, we're going to give this polling application one more try. So it looks like it's going to be compatible this time. This one is more of a test to see if you were paying attention to Brad's excellent presentation. But again, if you wanted to go to your smartphones, go to pollev.com/summitERB. There should be a new question there for you. Is it there? Do we have it? Can someone show me a hand if we see the new question? No, you don't see the new question? Is it coming? Just the old question? All right. Well, I think we're going to abandon this then. We need to move on. All right, well, it's too bad that didn't work, but I'll hand it back off to Rachel.
Okay. You'll notice we only invited the American speakers from other very cold cities. So next up will be Jamie Ponce from City of Chicago. Jamie is Chicago City Director for the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, working to drive environmental and economic benefits in the City of Chicago and across a network of global megacities. Jamie focuses on energy efficiency and clean energy, including the development and implementation of Chicago's energy benchmarking and transparency ordinance. Also urban sustainability governance and market-driven resource stewardship. Jamie, come on up.
I might need a hand with the slides just to advance.
Once it goes off of that, where's this? Is that going to work? There we go.
There we are. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you to the City of Toronto, to the Province of Ontario, to the Integro Group. I really can't commend you strongly enough for the thoughtful way that you're going about thinking about benchmarking, reporting, transparency, and that the way that that will shape energy policy going forward, the way that that will shape knowledge within the real estate market, and eventually driving energy savings, cost savings, and greenhouse gas emission reduction. So thanks very much for including me, the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, Chicago, and others in the conversation. Oops. By way of introduction, as Rachel mentioned, I'm the Chicago City Director for the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. C40 is a global network of now 71 cities whose mayors and senior officials and partners and business communities are committed to greenhouse gas emission reduction and climate risk management. And as you look at the map of cities all over the world, 14 of those 71 cities are in North America, including Toronto, including New York, including Boston, who we'll hear from in a moment, and including Chicago. Actually, 8 of the 10 US cities with benchmarking and transparency legislation are C40 cities. The balance of C40 cities are everywhere else, and you can see, looking at the map, the vast majority of those cities are located right on the front lines of climate change, particularly when it comes to physical threat of marine water rise. But whether you're on the marine coasts or whether you're on the coast of the Great Lakes, big cities everywhere share a lot of the same challenges. Ross shared a snapshot of greenhouse gas emission sources in big cities in the US. Many of our cities look the same in terms of our carbon footprints, but we're also grappling with the same challenges in terms of providing reliable energy service, providing public transportation, conventional transportation, water, wastewater management, building sustainable communities, and the list goes on. So my role is based full-time in Chicago, doing what C40 does with all of our cities, which is really helping to support, facilitate, accelerate, and elevate climate action in those cities. So Chicago, like Toronto, like New York, like Boston, has some really ambitious environmental goals that are all focused on making Chicago more livable, competitive, and sustainable. Chicago has a history of climate action planning going back to 2008, when Chicago's Climate Action Plan laid out Kyoto-style greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, 25% by 2020, and that big target that Jim mentioned earlier today of 80% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050. That's not going to happen on its own. We can't buy our way out of it. It really requires some adaptive, transformational thinking on the part of not just governments, but residents and businesses and everyone else who's involved in all of the activities that happen within our cities. More recently, Mayor Emanuel created the Sustainable Chicago 2015 Action Agenda, which takes those long-term climate goals and puts them into a 3-year context that focuses on 7 themes, 24 goals, and 100 actions, again, focused on livability, competitiveness, and environmental sustainability. Sometimes Mayor Emanuel's reputation precedes him when I speak, even outside of Illinois' borders. And of all of the quotes that are attributed to the mayor, sometimes this one doesn't rise as highly, but it's one that really frames Chicago's energy efforts in saying that a sustainable Chicago is a city that spends less on energy use with each passing year, creates good-paying jobs in up-and-coming industries, that maintains and upgrades its infrastructure, including built environment infrastructure, and ensures that every Chicagoan has the opportunity to live a healthy and active lifestyle. I'm sure that the mayors of all of our cities, Toronto, New York, anywhere else in the province of Ontario, shares these goals. What I think is unique about Chicago is the way that we're pursuing them through not just a single silver bullet policy or panacea program, but through a suite of actions that includes benchmarking and transparency, really to help achieve those goals. So in Sustainable Chicago 2015, that 3-year action plan that I mentioned, the second of the 7 themes is energy efficiency and clean energy, second only to job creation and clean tech. And within that goal, the city's committing to improving citywide energy efficiency by 3% or 5% within 3 years. And in Chicago, that takes really 2 paths, and these illustrate the multiple approaches that are necessary to tackle issues as complex as energy use and carbon emissions. We have voluntary programs and policy efforts. On the voluntary side, which Bruce highlighted very nicely here in Toronto, we in Chicago have a program similar to the Race to Reduce called Retrofit Chicago that has municipal, commercial, residential components. It works nicely with LEED certification, with Energy Star certification, with Green Globes, with other voluntary energy leadership programs. And we also have policy efforts, including benchmarking and transparency, which we're focused on now, but there's also a broader policy context too, that includes energy codes and other efforts to raise awareness and to manage energy use in buildings. So again, this context is important, and I think it's important that the province of Ontario, that the City of Toronto consider this context and look to benchmarking and transparency as a possible policy solution, but not the answer. And we can talk more about sort of the interrelations between benchmarking, transparency, and other programs as we move into the Q&A. Chicago's benchmarking and transparency policy itself is really focused on raising awareness through benchmarking and transparency to unlock our energy efficiency market. We've been tightly focused in framing the ordinance to cover municipal, commercial, residential buildings bigger than 50,000 square feet. That's less than 1% of our building stock, but it represents approximately 20% of all building energy use in the city. Our ordinance really has 4 components. So those covered buildings are required to track whole building energy use using US EPA's Portfolio Manager tool. They report to the city annually. They verify data accuracy in the first year in which a building is required to report and every 3 years thereafter. Chicago is the first city to have passed or included in its ordinance a data verification component. And then finally, the city is authorized to share building data. We've talked about these other 10 cities in the US. We've talked about the 2 states. There are also benchmarking and transparency efforts afoot in other countries, and we have a view to that through the C40. But the key for us, especially in North America, is realizing that our building portfolios don't stop at city limits. We're working with real estate portfolios that have buildings in many, if not all, of the cities with legislation. That doesn't mean that there's a cookie cutter or a model code that anyone would advocate that every city just adopt plain and simple, but we do need to think about consistency and alignment across our city policies, really to make it clear and easy for our buildings to understand what they're required to do and then to go ahead and do it. Just diving a little bit deeper into some of the rationale behind each of those 4 components of our policy. First of all, tracking whole building energy use using Portfolio Manager. What we're achieving there is adopting standard energy efficiency metrics. We talk all the time about the miles per gallon fuel efficiency comparison, which makes it really easy to tell if a vehicle that you're driving is more or less fuel efficient than another. You can drive any car you want. It could be a hybrid or it could be a tank on the road, but at least a driver knows when they purchase a vehicle, when they fuel the vehicle and operate it, how efficient it is. Standard metrics give us that comparable comparison and a way to measure building energy performance as well. And the idea of tracking whole building energy use is that whole building systems are many of the largest users of energy within a building. By focusing on whole building energy use, the city's not meddling or getting too deeply involved in individual tenants or occupants' finances or cost data or rental agreements. Privacy all over North America is a top concern. So by focusing on whole building energy use, Chicago's ordinance and other cities' ordinances are able to steer clear of some of those challenges. The second piece, buildings report to the city annually, which enables the type of aggregate reporting that we're beginning to do in Chicago that Ross shared from New York. It allows us to understand citywide performance, to track trends over time, to target policies, and also by requiring reporting to the city as opposed to just having buildings benchmark on their own, it really fosters accountability for understanding energy use. The unique one in Chicago, data accuracy, really does set our ordinance apart, and we haven't declared victory yet on the data quality challenge, but we've seen some really promising signs within the first year and a half of implementation of our ordinance. The data verification requirement in Chicago came right out of conversations like this one with other cities. When Chicago was putting together its ordinance, we went to New York, we went to Washington, D.C., we went to Austin and Seattle, and we asked them, what would you have done differently, or what are you struggling with now? And without fail, those cities shared data quality issues. Not necessarily intentional ones, or not necessarily that benchmarking is all that complicated for a building, but it is easy to make order of magnitude errors that can really throw off some of the aggregate data and could have other repercussions down the road. So what Chicago did was to require buildings covered by our ordinance, again, in the first year and every third year thereafter, to have the data they report to the city be verified by an individual who holds a recognized credential. The city, in the first year of ordinance implementation and now going ahead to 2015, recognizes 6 credentials. We can talk more if it's of interest during the Q&A about the specifics behind that and the criteria that the city used to recognize credentials. But the goals are really twofold there. One is to ensure that Chicago has as good a data quality in building energy use as anywhere and as possible. And the second is also to ensure that buildings themselves have access to individuals who are trained in efficient building operations, who know about benchmarking and who know what to do with benchmarking data. We do allow those verifiers to be in-house or third-party resources, as long as they're trained and credentialed in one of those programs recognized by the city. And then finally, Chicago's ordinance does authorize the city, like New York, like 6 out of the 10 cities in the US with transparency regulations on the book, to share individual building data beginning with the second year in which a building reports. And the idea there, again, is to increase knowledge, increase transparency, to put energy performance information in the hands of all of the stakeholders who are impacted by it, and to allow the market to value building energy performance in a way that's just not possible to do when we can't look at a building and see how efficient it may be. Quick look at the timeline in Chicago, not to dwell on this too closely, but particularly as the city and the province are considering what might lie ahead. Chicago's energy benchmarking process started something like this back in 2012 with stakeholder discussions bringing together our BOMA Chicago chapter, energy efficiency advocates, environmentalists, and others, to create an ordinance that was tailored to Chicago's market and achieved those policy goals in our Climate Action Plan and Sustainable Chicago 2015. We passed the ordinance in September of 2013. Buildings were notified for the first time, all individually, in the spring of 2014, leading up to our first compliance deadline in June of 2014. That was accompanied by extensive building-specific outreach. We had free trainings. We had a telephone and email help center that was available to support building questions and to shepherd them through that process. We had city buildings lead the way with early compliance. And then there was also coordinated outreach, not just by the city and the help center and our training partner, the U.S. Green Building Council, but more than 85 organizations that publicly supported the ordinance were getting the word out, really in a citywide effort to help buildings comply. Year one highlights really fell into 3 categories. We have, for the first time, a snapshot of energy performance across 348 buildings spanning 260 million square feet, representing more than 10% of citywide energy use. That was a big first step, but we started intentionally with Chicago's very biggest commercial buildings, larger than 250,000 square feet. Many of those buildings were benchmarking already. Many of those buildings are part of big portfolios. We really intentionally started in Chicago with the buildings that we knew we could reach, we knew we could partner with, before extending to hundreds, if not thousands, more buildings that are smaller commercial or municipal structures and eventually residential buildings. In our first year, we had a 92% compliance rate, which included not only submitting benchmarking information to the city, but meeting that data verification requirement, which I think reflects 2 things. First of all of that outreach, the help, the training that was available, but also the fact that we started with the largest buildings. We knew who they were, we knew where they were. As we progress to smaller buildings, there will be different challenges in reaching them and bringing many new buildings into the benchmarking fold that may not have been tracking energy use before. So we had a terrific first year. We knew we had to get it right in 2014, but we do have work ahead. For the first time, we do have sector-specific performance information that we analyzed and reported on in 2015. The graphic on the left-hand side of the screen is our infographic that helps tell the story of Chicago energy benchmarking to date, the goals, the participation, and the savings potential that we've identified by looking at the potential impact of having real buildings raise their energy performance either to the 50th percentile or the 75th percentile level of performance based on energy use intensity within their sectors. And this is just the buildings that reported in the first year of our ordinance. So as opposed to hypothetical savings estimates and calculations and trying to figure out what energy use might be in different building types, Chicago's actually building a platform of that data. And the data allows us to engage individual buildings and the built environment as a whole in a very new way. We'll have time for Q&A in just a moment, but again, to reiterate the partnership that has helped Chicago Energy Benchmarking succeed, we had 85 public supporters. We have a Chicago Energy Benchmarking Working Group. There are many organizations that have been involved in educating buildings, helping them comply, and really setting Chicago Energy Benchmarking on a path to success. We'll chat more in just a few minutes, but we do have a website with all of the information I've shared and more. It's www.cityofchicago.org/energy benchmarking. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Couple of quick housekeeping things. For those of you who are listening via webinar, wherever you are, can you please mute your phones? We've had a request for you all to mute your phones. We will have another presentation right now, and then I'm going to move the break forward, give you all a break, and then we'll come back, reconvene for the 5th presentation and the Q&A. So finally hearing from our 3rd freezing cold American city, snowiest of the 3, I would say, Ben Myers from Boston. Ben is the Sustainability Manager at Boston Properties. Boston Properties is one of the largest owners, managers, and developers of first-class office and mixed-use properties in the U.S. So Boston Properties has holdings in at least 4 of the cities in the U.S. that have benchmarking ordinances. Ben's work includes whole building approaches to sustainable design, sustainable building operations, energy conservation, and renewable energy development. Prior to joining Boston Properties, Ben was a green building coordinator at Harvard University.
I thought we were going to replace this slide with the. Well, I wasn't ready to defend the Bruins today, so please just ignore that. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, IMT. Thank you, BOMA, for sponsoring today's event. Thank you, Toronto and the Ontario for encouraging this public-private discussion and dialogue. When I first started studying sustainability back in early 2000s in school, Toronto just kept coming up over and over again as a real leader in sustainability, whether it was street trees, public transportation, or the district chilled water system. I've always viewed this city as a leader, so I'm really honored to be here in front of an audience of sustainability practitioners and those of you that are carrying out really impressive initiatives on a global scale. Today, we have a lot of policy planners in the room, a lot of people familiar with building energy reporting and disclosure. I'm going to provide an owner's perspective. I'm not an energy disclosure policy maker, but we have some experience reporting that might be valuable to the discussion. So we're owners, developers, and managers of Class A office space in the United States. We have holdings in New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston. These are some of our assets. They're large, some of them iconic buildings in core business districts. We're a real estate investment trust, self-administered and self-managed, with about 60 million square feet, 44 million of which is office buildings proper, and then about 15 million of structured parking. In the upper left-hand is the property distribution, so you'll see our largest portfolio is in Boston, followed closely by New York, then Washington, D.C., and San Francisco. We have 750 employees and a gross asset value of about $18.8 billion. This slide, I'm actually happy that I gave credit to IMT as the source of this information, not knowing that they'd be presenting very similar data. It's from a couple of years ago, so this is probably not current, but there's about 5 billion square feet reporting in the United States. As you can see, from what you saw earlier, New York is the largest. I've highlighted in green the 4 cities where we have property reporting. And specifically at Boston Properties, we have 27.2 million square feet that falls into the reporting thresholds. And it's broken up such that about 39% is in New York, 29% in Boston, 15% in San Francisco, and 17% in DC. I also include some statistics here to emphasize that our buildings aren't the top performers, right? We have great performing, high performance buildings, and we have underperformers. They run the whole spectrum. So our average energy use intensity, this is site EUI, not to be confused with source, is 78.7, and our average Energy Star score is 79.5. So our average of these properties reporting isn't even in the top 25% where many of these ordinances want us to be. And the total reported square foot represents about 61% of our portfolio. And that's largely due not to building size, but rather jurisdictional location. So some of our properties may be in the region of Boston, but are positioned in an edge city that doesn't fall underneath the ordinance. So we saw a little bit about where ordinances are required and where reporting is required. This is a slide I came up with just charting over time the transition from voluntary to regulated disclosures. So I should emphasize that we were voluntarily recording most of our buildings in Portfolio Manager prior to the adoption of ordinances as an energy conservation best practice. We required it as a company because we wanted to be able to benchmark internally, and we wanted to be able to benchmark against CBEX data, and we wanted to see where we fell against that data set. So in DC, we have the Clean and Affordable Energy Act, New York City, Local Law 84, which was discussed earlier. San Francisco, we have the existing Commercial Building Energy Performance Ordinance. In Boston, we have the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance, also known as BERDO, which is probably worse than ERB, but memorable nonetheless. And then in Cambridge, we have BUDO. So I live in Cambridge and I work in Boston, so this is just one more thing to mix up, BUDO and BERDO. One thing to note that really helped us gain confidence with reporting is that cities often lead by example and report first. So we had demonstrated leadership in the cities that I think dispelled some concerns we had internally about putting our information out there publicly for the city to parse out. So we were involved in BERDO, the Boston ordinance, closely. We gave testimony at City Hall. We supported the Chief of Energy Environment, Brian Sweat, as he pounded pavement to get the thing passed through. There were organizations for and against it. We were members of some of the organizations against it. We still came out for it, despite not complete alignment of the real estate community. I think we made the right decision in hindsight to support the ordinance, and I'm happy with the courage to do so, but for a period of time, I think our regional manager wanted a bodyguard when we attended some of the testimony discussions. So for the first year of reporting in Boston, 900 buildings reported representing 175 million gross square feet. That represents an 84% compliance rate. Buildings required to report represented only 2.5% of the properties and 40% of the square footage, and I think you see that same sort of disproportionate counts. The idea is it's like 80-20 rule, get the most with the least amount of people affected. In the city of Boston, their primary findings were that there was a large range of variability among commercial office buildings and energy consumption. So that's absolute consumption. And then energy use intensity, when it's broken down over square feet, varied about 8 times from the low performers to the top performers. So really large range. And I heard MPG thrown out there. A lot of ways to look at this. I think they're going to find that a lot of the top consumers are data center, high performance computing centers, and large, heavy data intense operating facilities. And we have a lot of those too in Cambridge's Kendall Square area, where energy use intensity is off the chart. That we're trying to work with the city to fairly represent those buildings, and so you can do apples to apples comparisons. In Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., I did a quick scan of some of the similarities and differences between the different reporting requirements. Some of the big findings that I found are that energy efficiency reporting in New York requires audits and retro-commissioning. So when looking at the cost of compliance, you have to consider the retro-commissioning aspect, which can be substantial. Also need to consider audits and required audits, which are fairly consistent across the board as a potential action. Also worth noting is San Francisco's policy covers buildings as large as 10,000 square feet, so it's fairly small buildings required to report. All of our buildings are larger than 10,000 feet, so that would mean every one of them. Finally, at the bottom, the San Francisco, the ASHRAE energy audit you can become exempt if you are a LEED building or an Energy Star building, which I think incentivizes us to push for LEED or Energy Star to work our way out of any sort of actions or penalties resulting from these ordinances. I should note one more thing. In New York, we opted into early compliance, so we put all of our buildings through an energy auditing program, and we paid about 4.5 cents a square foot for an ASHRAE Level 2 energy audit, and we received about $0.015 in incentives from the city to do those audits. So it was a fairly generous rebate, brought down the net cost to about 3 cents. And it was great. It provides great data for a guy like me working on sustainability. I can call up the property manager, request the audit, and see what sort of low-hanging fruit we have left in those buildings and find a right time to pursue those projects. Again, I'm representing the owner's perspective, so I wanted to provide some information that might be useful to some of the owners in the room. The cost to implement a reporting is largely dependent on if you're going to do it internally or externally. We've opted to do it all internally. Part of the reason is because we already had the expertise in-house to train others in using Portfolio Manager. Total cost, which is really time for those people, is about 2.5 hours to set up the account, assign space types, occupancy, and all the rest. And then tenant data, permission, and retrieval could be more or less of a task depending on how many tenants you have in your building. I averaged out that it's about a half an hour to an hour with a property management coordinator to get that permission, and it varies from region to region how that permission is acquired, but it's usually a letter, some sort of consent letter from the tenant. Monthly routine maintenance, I estimated about half an hour a month for a total of 6 hours a year with a property management coordinator. And then annual maintenance supervision from a regional engineer. I think it's important to have reporting oversight from someone more senior and familiar with energy use in buildings. I think that'll help make sure the data is correct. And I think as we saw in Chicago, they require validation. So you want to make sure what you're submitting is accurate. And then, so the total initial cost in year one maintenance is probably about $500. And then annual recurring cost of $300. But that could vary widely depending on your tenant mix and whether or not you're performing the work internally. So I'm going to quickly run through 3 of the benefits that we think we get from reporting. Certainly there's an elevated awareness and performance visibility. And then there's informed allocation of energy management resources and performance targets, followed by improved sustainability, key performance indicator accounting, and disclosure. So I'll run through what those 3 mean quickly. First, it's about awareness and visibility. So this data is pulled directly from Portfolio Manager and then made a little bit prettier. But what I'm showing is a 2008 energy use intensity versus a 2014 energy use intensity with the light green and dark green bars respectively, and then the yellow is the delta in energy use intensity at those assets, and I've sorted them by largest to smallest, and we have about 160 buildings in Portfolio Manager, so it's a very quick way to scan how buildings are trending and then also identify where you can get the largest absolute energy savings. If you look to the left, that's where your largest buildings are. So this data, had we not been recording our energy use in Portfolio Manager, wouldn't have been available. It wouldn't have been a source. We'd be digging up utility bills from 2008. So we now have a database that I think we can put to use and work for our company. Following that, informed performance targets. So as a sustainability manager, one of my objectives is to come up with sensible and science-based policies. So, it sounds crazy, but to come up with a real emissions goal that makes sense for our company, I need to know where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed. Portfolio Manager data allows you to sort by year and then break down how you're performing. It also provides you with Scope 1 direct emissions at your building level. So instead of going through a rigorous inventory of your carbon emissions, you have a number right there that's fairly accurate for all intents and purposes of coming up with a quick inventory for your company. So so that's really how we're coming up with our goals today, and it looks like we're going to be able to come out and publicly announce a fairly ambitious carbon emissions goal, and I credit all the property management coordinators who've been putting data into Portfolio Manager for allowing us to do that in a thoughtful manner. Finally, improved disclosure, and disclosure is becoming more and more important at Boston Properties. We participate annually in the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark Survey. This survey has 40-plus investor members that look at our data and our non-financial data that covers a wide range of sustainability issues. If we have accurate data in Portfolio Manager, we can push our energy and water data directly into the GRESB survey, which saves us a lot of time collecting, formatting, and submitting information to GRESB. And then there's also talk about SASB, and we're going to see more sustainability accounting coming. So we think we're preparing for the future and not waiting for the future to come to us. And one last thought, when there's a scoreboard, people play differently. So going through the process of entering data into Portfolio Manager, studying that data, synthesizing that data, having a better understanding of how we're performing, I think, and also shaming some of our property managers into doing things they might not otherwise be doing, helps us improve our performance across the portfolio, and also allows us to apply for awards that we wouldn't otherwise be eligible for. We became members of, elite members of Certification Nation in 2014, a program that the EPA launched to recognize people with large quantities of their portfolio that have achieved the Energy Star label. We've got 51 buildings now of our 160 or so that have gotten the label. And then we received the coveted NAREIT Leader in the Light Award for our performance in the GRESB survey, so there's some synergy there now. And then we received the GRESB Green Star Award in 2014. So all these awards, I think, were made possible in a way by our reporting through Portfolio Manager. So that is it from me. I hope that was helpful.
Okay. Final speaker today is Michael Brooks, who I've had the pleasure of sitting next to all morning, and I'll tell you that he has the loudest clap in the room. Michael is also the Chief Executive Officer of REALpac, the Senior Canadian Trade Association for large public and institutional investment real estate companies. REALpac represents the investment real estate industry in government relations, public relations, and standard setting. Without further ado, Michael.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's always tough going last on a bunch of speakers. You know you'll get squeezed out for time. and people will be PowerPointed out by the time that you finally get up. So apologize for another dose, that sheep's dose of one more feeding of PowerPoint. But really what I'm going to talk about is best conveyed by seeing a little bit of information. I don't have a time clock. I've got this Fitbit here, which tells me I've only walked 6,000 steps so far today. And that means I got 4,000 to go. This thing sends you emails, like to tell you how you're doing weekly, daily. And I talk about that actually deliberately, because the point of this, other than motivating everybody, is to make the point again that information is transformational. So I've done 10,000 steps a day every day since January the 1st. I'm down almost 20 pounds. So if you act on that, that's really good. Some of this data, well, actually, this data you might have talked about before. This is US GBC data. I think there's probably better and more relevant data that our previous participants have disclosed about this, but this really is why we are part of the problem. This data is probably 5 years out of date, but it's US GBC data, and I still use it from time to time in slides. But I'm going to tell a story about a collaboration that started in 2007 with the Canada Green Building Council, our first foray into energy use intensity metrics. This is a study that was done with CAGBC. We kind of helped muster our sheep, if I can call them that, to CAGBC to get them to disclose office building energy consumption data in a rudimentary normalized benchmarking system that Enerlife had prepared for CAGBC. And so what's interesting about this data set, the blue lines are 2005, the red lines are 2007. As you can see, the distribution in equivalent kilowatt hours a square foot a year. Some places around the world convert to gigajoules. I think I saw BTUs this morning. We use equivalent kilowatts, and we convert everything to kilowatts. Deep lake water cooling, natural gas, propane, whatever, we convert to kilowatts. And we had some rudimentary normalization in this data set. And you can see kind of the leading buildings at this point in time. We're kind of in the 25, shall we say, equivalent kilowatt hours a square foot a year. And this motivated us to get together as a collective, BOMA, Canada Green Building Council, REALpac, to a bit of a deeper dive on portfolio managers normalization and how could we build a better normalization that takes into account server farms, call centers, underground parking garage, occupancy, vacancy, other unusual uses in a building to get, and weather, of course, Vancouver to Toronto, that we can get to a more durable number. We also looked at issues such as what's the burn? This data point here was actually quite transformational because so many owners told us they were shocked to find out what the consumption was at 3 in the morning. And why is there so much consumption at 3? What's on at 3 in the morning? Who's sabotaged what? What isn't working properly? Who hasn't repaired what? Who hasn't maintained what? And surely we can do better at 3 in the morning than what we are doing. And the shape of this curve, do we really need to crank that up at 5 in the morning? If we pushed it back an hour, could we save a little bit of the curve and shave a little bit of the burn as a result of that? This ended up with if I can go back to my first, a really bold prediction of a target. And I have a few scars for this, but we joined together with CAGBC and BOMA in 2009 to announce a target for office buildings in Canada of 20 equivalent kilowatt hours to be achieved by 2015, hence 20 by 15. So all at once we have a data set with both relative performance disclosed and absolute performance disclosed on a equivalent normalized basis. So you can compare your building on an apples to apples basis, Vancouver, Toronto, Winnipeg, doesn't matter where you are. Our target building, we reprofiled. What does a 20 equivalent kilowatt hour a square foot building look like? How much of it is lighting? How much of it is plug load? How much of it is fans? This particular pie chart was transformational for our industry because as soon as we revealed this pie chart, owners would say, yikes, I've got 15% of office equipment burn. That spawned the tenant engagement activity across the country because all of a sudden, in this rough chart, 30% of electricity is outside of the landlord's control in a multi-tenant office building, hence the need to engage tenants. So, and then each of these items, lighting's been around since the 80s. People have been doing lighting retrofits since the 80s. But when you get to see still the size of that pie, even in a 20 building, you know that lighting is a key area. It's usually number one on people's hit parade in terms of target. We also understood that there was a sequence to the activities of landlords in addressing these issues. Measurement and benchmarking, that message has been given over and over this morning. It is the foundation piece. Pick your cliche. What gets measured gets managed. There's 5 or 6 or 7 of those cliches. But everybody has to start by counting. And what we've enabled our owners to do nationally is to be able to count on a relative basis. The second part, policy, process, people. This is the free stuff. Turn off lights. That's the residential equivalent. But what's your management practices? What time do you crank up your building HVAC system in the morning? When do you crank it down? If people are too hot on a winter day, that's an absolute waste. If people are too cold on a summer's day, that's an absolute waste. So some of the better landlords tying that to tenant complaints. What are you hearing from your tenants at what time of the day? People, training people, avoiding sabotage, what's been wrecked, what's been jimmied open, what isn't working properly, moves you into the recommissioning piece. And then finally, retrofitting. And it's amazing how many people were jumping to the retrofit piece. Let's change your HVAC system as step one. No. Step one is getting control of your management, doing your incentives, bonusing your building managers, making it one of their KPIs. It's all the free stuff that you should be doing first. So we built our revised normalized data set. This is our 2011 data set, 371 buildings. And you can see that the 25th percentile, now it dropped to about 23.5 equivalent kilowatt hours a square foot a year. And so now we have this distribution. I think I saw 8-to-1 ratio of worst building to best building in one of the earlier slides. Well, here's some more proof. Look at that building at the top. Yikes, if you're the owner of that building and you were just exposed, you've got to be thinking, what the heck is going on in my building? And maybe you're patting yourself on the back if you're around 15. But look, there's someone in here around 9. That looks like a data error to me, but you'd have to figure that out. Here's 2012's data set, and we've got some movement. So now we got the 25th percentile at around 20. So this is 2012, and a quarter of our buildings in our data set have already hit our 2015 target. 2013, around the same. The one defect that we have in our data set is that we haven't yet matched equivalent building to equivalent building. So you could swap out some buildings next year and swap in other buildings, but we are going to work on that as well. What does it expose? Well, you'd think that Vancouver buildings would be super energy efficient. Maybe they don't burn as much because the climate's much nicer out there. But when you normalize, so you can compare on an apples-to-apples basis, you go, yikes, look at my Vancouver portfolio. It's actually worse than my Ontario portfolio. So things that might be counterintuitive to you all of a sudden become intuitive. You know what? There are more energy hogs out there than where we are here. And so maybe as a portfolio, we should be focusing our CapEx spend on those buildings versus the Ontario buildings. It's a bit counterintuitive of a colder climate here. And there's Obama. What's he wearing on his wrist? The same thing I've got on his wrist. So that's the brief history, and information is transformative, and there's the proof he's on a diet. I'm going to turn it over to our panel now. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, everybody, for fantastic presentations. I'd like to actually welcome our panel up to our TED Talk style director's chairs here. And at this point, we'll be taking, we can take questions starting off from the audience. Or we can also, if you are listening online at home, you can also add in a presentation, or sorry, a question to our presenters via the chat option that we have for the WebEx. So if you do have a question right now, please raise your hand, and we'll have Rachel do her best Oprah, seek you out, and come out. So why don't we go here, Rachel, and then over to that side.
Thanks very much. Great presentations. Really enjoyed each and every one. A question for Ben on the practicality of benchmarking and the value to the property management company and tenants, et cetera. And it's all around the site versus source. I wonder if you could comment on that.
So I think you're talking about the source or site EUI. So we've chosen to use site energy use intensity because we believe it's more material to what we're doing in our buildings. So we're often talking about materiality and sustainability, and what metrics do we want to measure and report that represent our behavior and our performance. And source EUI could affect our performance based on decisions made on the supply side and not as much decisions made on the demand side and how we're operating and managing our buildings. So site EUI, we think, provides a more accurate representation of the areas where we have the levers to affect change. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's great.
Great. And then we had a question just over on that side over there.
Hi, Mike Mulqueen, Toronto Hydro. I was wondering if everyone could speak to experience working with utilities that are able to provide data, automated upload data versus utilities that have resisted that. So I know we're challenged in Toronto, and I'm wondering how other utilities have overcome that. You know, hearing that it is quite important for this initiative. So.
Hi. Okay. Yeah. So in New York, there are 3 utilities in play. There's National Grid, Con Edison, and the Department of Environmental, is the DEP. And of the 3, DEP is the only one submitting data automatically to Portfolio Manager. I think it was kind of I think there was some stumbling spots, but they're doing it pretty effectively at this point. And that was with a lot of pretty good interaction with EPA Portfolio Manager. I mean, I find the folks over there to be really engaged and ready to work with utilities that want to, automate the process. In terms of National Grid and Con Edison, I think there are folks at both who would love to be a part or kind of push forward an automated process, but it sounds as though there are kind of larger rate case issues at both of those utilities that is kind of providing some inertia. I think I personally would really like to see it happen at both places, but like I was saying at Con Edison, it's a spreadsheet that you have to basically request, and I think it's $102.50. For National Grid, it's a free request, but it's similar. It's a spreadsheet that you're receiving back, and I think that they're big organizations, and the folks that we end up talking to don't feel like they have the leverage to push it quite yet. But I'd say that the drawback is that because you're handling spreadsheets, there's a lot of opportunity for human error. And I think the other struggle, which I think we were talking about for utilities, is they have meters and they understand things on a meter basis, but defining what meters make up a building is a step that utilities generally have to work through before they can do it effectively.
I'm happy to speak to that one as well, because in Chicago, utility collaboration, utility provided data has been a huge enabler of our ordinance. The ordinance requires whole building data, however building owners or managers are able to get it. But far and away, the preferred, recommended, easiest way to get that whole building data is 12 magic numbers from your electricity utility distributor and your natural gas utility distributor, and then any other fuel sources. In Chicago, ComEd, our electricity provider, actually was far ahead of the game. I think that whether you're north or south of the border, especially in the real estate industry, we love to hate the utilities. But ComEd really was a leader in this space. And they, several years, or when benchmarking and transparency was just a glimmer in energy advocates' eyes, ComEd started offering whole building automated energy aggregation, electricity aggregation as a customer service at no incremental cost. And they really saw that as a way to make their customers' lives easier and to provide relevant information. So we were very fortunate to work with them. They had the automated tool ready to go when our ordinance came about. And we really didn't want to pass an ordinance that would require managers to knock on their tenants or occupants' doors and ask for last year's utility bills. In the natural gas space in Chicago, we had a very collaborative utility, but not one that was as far ahead of the game. So as we were crafting the ordinance in Chicago, the city and several partners started working proactively with People's Gas, our natural gas utility, to make sure that, particularly as you think about residential buildings that have individually metered condos or individually metered apartments on natural gas, that there was a way to provide the aggregate data. And they were able to work with us. To their credit, they don't have automated data upload into Portfolio Manager, but we were able to work with them to provide a whole building solution that provides the data that managers and owners need to comply. There are real estate markets that have high functioning benchmarking policies that don't have utility data aggregation, but I do think that that's been a really critical partnership in Chicago, and it's certainly eased the load that covered building owners and managers have to carry.
Just as a follow-on question here to the whole panel, what do you think are some of the things that, for our building owners in the room that they could do to get ready for a possible energy reporting and benchmarking disclosure ordinance? So, whether it was through Race to Reduce or your experience, Michael, or any of the experiences in the U.S., what do you think would be the advice you'd give to building owners and managers to get ready for such a program?
Start saving your utility bills would be the first advice.
Put them on the fridge, on the magnet?
That's right. Yeah, in a manila folder on top of the fridge.
Yeah,
where mine are. So I think getting information about your space type use is something that you should be prepared to provide for setting up an account. Also, your occupancy and your gross square footage. And I found that we had in different databases 3 different gross square footages for some of our properties. It may sound like a small thing, but consistency there was a challenge. I would also go and start looking at the tools out there, like Portfolio Manager. I'm not sure what it's going to look like in Toronto or Ontario, but Portfolio Manager has lots of online tutorials that'll walk you through setting up an account. It's not rocket science, and we were able to do it without too much brain damage. So I think acquiring a level of comfort with those tools is something you could probably achieve in 30 minutes over lunch.
Yeah, I guess just to add on to what kind of Ben pointed out about Portfolio Manager, the New Jersey Institute for Technology has actually a certificate and like maybe it's 4 or 5 online courses free around benchmarking with a focus on Portfolio Manager. So, I think you've developed a training program in-house, but for groups that don't necessarily have that, that's probably a good resource to consider. It was developed with a lot of input by EPA, so I think it's as close to official as you can get.
I think one of the challenges is most of the large tenants and landlords probably have people dedicated to doing this already, and so whilst it may not be 100% in alignment with whatever ordinance or bylaws come down, they're probably ahead of the curve. I think the real challenge is going to be the landlords of smaller buildings. They may not necessarily have the support staff to be able to do a powerful job in this. And I think the best advice to them would be to either appoint someone in their organization to be that accountable person to understand what's coming, to understand what needs to happen inside of the organization. And then as many in the learned panel here have referred to, there's many sources out there. REALpac, Michael and his team are a fountain of knowledge. CivicAction certainly has put forth a lot of tools and thoughts around how to do a better job of reporting, which is in effect a precursor to compliance.
Any other thoughts? Building on that, what do you think are some of the best resources, or what were kind of the most effective programs in assisting owners that were taken on by, say, the jurisdictions to really maybe up compliance or just get people more comfortable with the policies?
So I think Jamie probably is going to say a lot of the same stuff, but the help desk in New York was, I think, really big. A lot of engagement with building owners, but I think also, I'm not sure if this is really the same in Chicago or not, but in New York City, the top, so 50% of the buildings are represented by the 40 biggest consultants. So reaching out to that group gives you a lot of kind of bang for your buck. We have consultant roundtables at least annually, sometimes more often, to kind of communicate updates to our process. And this year we were talking about changes to Portfolio Manager and their data quality improvements to the interface. So I'd say, communication with the consultants that are providing benchmarking services, and then the help desk that was in place for a number of years and which we're actually restarting hopefully soon, which was a call center, and then I think it turned to a call back center and then back to a call center, so it kind of took different forms.
So I definitely agree, and Chicago did have the benefit of learning from New York's implementation. I mentioned training in our presentation. We trained 375 individuals in 2014. That training was actually delivered by local energy professionals. So architects, professional engineers, energy service providers volunteered to give those trainings, usually over lunch hour, usually in an architecture firm's conference room or another gathering space. That actually made a big difference. We can talk about training, but how it's delivered and by whom it's delivered made a real difference. We also had a help center. There was a single phone number, there was a single website, there was a single email address, and we've had more than 800 building interactions, well, building and service provider interactions through that help center. The offering utility data and working closely with the utilities to communicate the availability of whole building energy data and how to go about getting it was huge. We had comprehensive written materials that dovetail with EPA Portfolio Manager guidance. So it's not difficult to come up with the list of possible support activities, but I do think that it's worth noting how benchmarking is communicated and how it's organized and coordinated makes a big difference. It's one thing to have tons of training sessions going on every day of the year across the city, but if no one can find them, it's not going to help. Not to pick on the spaghetti chart of the org structure in New York that was highlighted before.
I've included it for a reason, yeah.
I mean, my takeaway on that, without picking on anybody, is that we can make this as complicated as we want.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of opportunities to streamline that support. And I think particularly when it comes to a new policy, how it's communicated and doing everything we can to make sure that it's communicated consistently can really facilitate adoption and compliance and reduce the brain damage all around, not just for buildings, but for policymakers and everybody else involved in the system.
Yeah.
So understanding what benchmarking is and what it isn't was as important as anything, even in the whole landscape of help center, phone lines, emails, trainings, and everything else in Chicago.
Yeah, let's go back to the audience here for a moment. So we'll go there and then over to Thomas here, and over to Brian.
Philippe Bernier, Truvis. Jamie, you mentioned ways of reducing brain damage. I'm curious if, be it in Chicago or Ben in San Francisco, Ross in New York, whether there was as a precursor now or looking forward, if you've heard anything, enabling legislation before introducing mandatory energy reporting and benchmarking to have the utilities disclose or make available to managers or owners of buildings the whole building data. I think we appreciate the challenge, many of us in this room, of accessing tenant data where they have financial control. Has there been any enabling legislation to reduce that burden on, frankly, everybody?
Very quickly in Chicago, there's a bit of a jurisdictional challenge in regulating the utilities, since our utilities are regulated at the state level, and Chicago's benchmarking policy is a municipal ordinance. So it's not really within the purview of the city to mandate or require that the utilities provide that data. But Chicago's the largest market for those utilities in their service territories, and even though we're not waving the regulation stick, it was the city was able to engage really productively with the utilities to make sure that this service was available. Our ordinance was written to allow it to move forward even in the absence of utility data, but it was always our strong intent and preference to have whole building utility data available to buildings to help them comply.
Right, and I think it's pretty similar. The local ID4 was written so that there was a requirement for, I guess, building owners to aggregate it if it was not available from utilities. But I guess in a perfect world, it would be automated. But we do have access, and that is a very good thing. I think I've talked to consultants, and they indicated that really nobody goes through that process. It'd be so painful to go through those large buildings and go to each tenant and have them retrieve the data. So having access is really fundamental and really important. So it was a part of the bill, but it's not really used.
I could just emphasize what's already been said here, but there's tremendous contrast between how our property managers perceive these requirements in San Francisco versus Boston, where in Boston we're using a tool to go and get tenant data for each account. And we own the Prudential Center. Anybody who's been to Boston, it's in the Back Bay. It's about 2.5 million square feet of mixed use retail and office. And so for that property in particular, we have a large quantity of retail tenants. It's essentially a shopping mall. So we feel some of the pain of the strip mall owners that go through this. And that's not it's not an insurmountable challenge, but it is cumbersome to go and get that tenant data. In California, on the other hand, in San Francisco, PG&E pushes the data and it's automated. So some of those guys, it's like they don't even know it's happening when I talk to them about our reporting. So it's been highly simplified by the utilities' automated data feed, where there's room for improvement in Boston.
Great. Thomas?
Thomas Müller from the Canada Green Building Council. I'm interested in the disclosure component of the benchmarking programs, because I think the benchmarking and reporting is a really important first step, and I think it brings about some change, but it seems like disclosure is the one that could really get owners into action. And I think one of the presenters even mentioned that individual buildings are disclosed in terms of the performance. So I'm kind of interested how you, for those of you, I think New York and Chicago actually do disclose. How did you get there? Because there must be some kind of heavy lifting involved in getting building owners to actually disclose energy performance of their buildings. And hence, next step being, I guess, labeling to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, its disclosure is written into local ID4, so it was a part of the bill of the law, kind of from the beginning. What we do disclose is much constrained or much cut back a lot from the actual data that we receive. So we try to pay attention to privacy concerns and other elements, and just kind of report kind of energy and water consumption related components. But I'd say that at this point, the disclosure also is, for the most part, it's a spreadsheet that you have access to and you can look through. It's not quite as visible as some. I mean, I think in Philadelphia, there's a mapping tool which will show building energy performance, which is a much more visible interface. And I think probably would get people's attention a little more. So I think that maybe something New York moves towards, but at this point, a spreadsheet isn't, people aren't getting really excited about it the same way they might through the mapping tool.
And I think my colleague said it about as well as you can, that you play the game differently when someone's keeping score. And transparency around individual building data really amounts to the scoreboard there. also, we talk about market transformation, and I think that most of us would agree that the lack of transparency or the lack of visibility of building energy performance makes it really tough to value energy performance in real estate transactions. And when it comes down to it, greenhouse gases are important, and annual OpEx is very important, but it's the building transactions that really move this market and drive investment and perceptions, and that's where the real opportunity for impact is. Without individual building transparency, it's hard to envision that same level of transformation. So that's why Chicago included the transparency component in our ordinance. But we also wanted to be reasonable about it. We know that a building is much more than just a number, and we want to give building owners and managers a chance to prepare for it. So Chicago's disclosure transparency component of the ordinance begins just with the second year of reported data. So 2014 was our first year of reported data for the buildings that phased in year one. This coming fall or winter of 2015 is when we'll see the first individual building disclosure. And it's likely to follow the New York model in terms of what the city does, which is using a data portal to share building addresses and then key energy performance metrics, and then possibly other information provided by buildings to help provide some additional context or color around their performance scores. But by making that data available to the public, what really gets interesting is how do we use that data, whether it's mapping, whether it's individual building performance profiles, whether it's, I really look forward to the day that we can hold a smartphone up to a building, open an app, and it'll overlay not just its current Energy Star score, but energy performance trends over time. And that's the sort of thing that tenants take into account, among many other factors, but that's at least part of the discussion when it comes to real estate transactions.
Great. Brian, we have one more question down here, did you? Then we'll go to the back.
Thank you. This question is mainly for Ben, but anyone who wants to jump in. I'm just curious, so you mentioned that your group is involved in development as well as managing properties, and I'm curious whether, with such a high percentage of your portfolio covered by these kind of reporting requirements, whether that would influence the direction on new developments, new buildings, either how they're built or how they're metered and sub-metered and the energy is managed, and also thinking through looking at that wealth of data about the performance of different building types. Does it play into decisions about new development as well?
That's a good question. So one area where I've become involved in our new development is to assess our energy modeling to see how we're tracking against best-in-class buildings across the United States. And these disclosures and the reporting that the cities have done on energy use intensity is the best data we have in the United States. I'm working off of, prior to these disclosures in this immense data set, we had a CBEX data set from 2003, and that was the best we had. And building technologies moved a long way. In our area in Boston, over the last 6 years, energy code is about 30% more stringent. So we're building to those new codes. So I think that's what's really driving the bus is those codes and then stretch codes that local communities have adopted on top of those codes. But I think there's a level of awareness about energy use intensity that's organizational now that may not have had existed had we not been benchmarking, that is helping us focus on energy performance during conceptual design and then doing iterative energy modeling throughout design development to try to drive down EUI. And you're seeing that now. Two projects I'll highlight, and you can look them up. One is 888 Boylston Street, which is going to be about 45% more efficient than a code-compliant building. And then Salesforce Tower in San Francisco, which is coming out of the ground now. I was out there, tremendous energy performance there. I think the EUI, and excuse me, I'm working in KBTU per square foot, anybody who's confused. We don't do the equivalent kilowatt hours. It's around 28, and a lot of that has to do with the climate zone and some of the economizing and natural ventilating that we can do there. But there is some sort of correlation. I think it's just a greater awareness in general of energy at the company.
Great.
Actually, I have a question for Ben real quick. So it sounds like you were benchmarking before 84, Local Law 84 and other policies pushed you into it. Are there, so maybe the case of the Local Law 87, retro commissioning and energy auditing, I mean, I'm just wondering how much of your actions maybe were pushed by policies, and then was that then kind of taken up and spread throughout the portfolio or not? That's kind of a concept IMT talks about, and I'm wondering if it kind of proves true or positive in your business.
So we have 4 regions, like I said: New York, Boston, San Francisco, and DC. And we're highly decentralized in the sense that we have entrepreneurial leaders in each of those regions doing what they feel that they should be doing. In Boston, I think we have demonstrated best practices in sustainability, and I would say there was a policy around 2008 to put all buildings in portfolio manager, and I think it was driven by the desire to have green certifications on every building. And when we were looking at LEED EB versus Energy Star label is the lower hanging fruit. And also, it's easier to look across all the buildings and figure out where we can bring our scores up with Energy Star to get every building labeled. And I think that was an early target for the Boston region. But I think that the disclosure ordinances have helped bring more of our portfolio into portfolio manager, certainly, that wasn't there like it was in Boston in 2008. So whether there's a large comprehensive policy driving that, I don't think so universally. I think these ordinances and energy reporting and benchmarking requirements are helping us add more of our stock to a tracking platform.
Brad, Michael, where do you think the local market is with that in terms of, the property developers and owners here, in terms of them getting their properties either into portfolio manager or your tool, REALpac's tool, Michael?
So recognizing for the moment that Daryl's company, bye Daryl, that REALpac is a large landlord organization, and they've been working on all of these things since 2007, 2008, 2009. They've been using our tool as an internal management tool amongst buildings within a large portfolio to evaluate and benchmark individual asset managers. They've been certifying under BOMA Best since 2006, 2007, 2008, and then LEED for starting with more the downtown office buildings, which requires Energy Star. So I would say for the larger landlords, they're almost all already doing this, and it's just part of their practice. They've staffed up. I think Daryl actually was the first hire in this business, and I think he was 2008. And we have someone in the room whose title is Chief Sustainability Officer, which you only see in Australia. So we've really come a long way organizationally with the bigger landlords. My interim conclusion would be that no one will be surprised by this. I think the bigger landlords will be ready for this. We'll still be concerned about some of these elements of it. I think smaller landlords, who I think were the ones a little more nervous about it in Chicago and Boston, who need to be brought farther up the learning curve and maybe looking for some assistance in terms of the CapEx need for that.
Okay.
Hi, this is Bala from BOMA, Toronto. This is a question for Ross and Jamie and Ben. To what extent programs such as Green Button is being used to ease the transaction between the utilities and the end user?
In Boston, Massachusetts, we use Green Button, and I think we have a more complete and accurate reporting because of Green Button. Otherwise, we'd be estimating a lot of the use, so we're able to get actual utility consumption with the Green Button.
Yeah, I don't see any use of Green Button in New York, so maybe it's just that I haven't heard about it, but in my day-to-day, I've not come across it.
Jamie, no?
Green Button's use is probably somewhere in the middle between New York and Boston and Chicago, where it's newer in our markets. It's really the utility's decision on whether or not to make that available. It's been piloted. Basically anything that helps that information flow facilitates benchmarking. Again, I mentioned ComEd, our electric utilities, long-standing energy usage data system tool. So in the case of our electric utility, Green Button came along a little later. It has been looked at being integrated. Green Button might be a good leapfrog tool for markets that don't currently have energy data aggregation at the whole building level. Less of a factor in Chicago, but potentially huge for new markets, Toronto, the province, and other cities.
Great. So I think I want to get into just a moment. We're contemplating here in the province of Ontario and Toronto also adding residential properties into a building energy use disclosure ordinance. Can you guys, reflect on any of your experiences with the residential market as opposed to the commercial market, and maybe how that market has responded? Or multifamily. So looking at, again, multifamily buildings, again, probably around that 50,000 square foot or up mark. What has been the experience in the U.S. market with bringing in that group of buildings?
Right, I mean, I think that a lot of, so multifamily is huge in New York. I think a lot of those buildings, a huge amount of them are represented by these consultants. And so I wouldn't say that I've heard a lot of feedback that is really dramatically different than other building types. It's more just that, these groups have built up the capacity to handle benchmarking for those groups. I think that part of maybe why you don't hear a whole lot coming back from the building owners at this point is that compliance is essentially a report has been submitted. Mm-hmm. If you start getting into scrutinizing the data about, this EUI doesn't look realistic, or there are gaps in your meter data, or, there's something missing here, I think that's when we may start seeing, a lot of people from the multifamily section in particular coming back with a lot more questions. And I think it basically would put more pressure on the consultants than has been there traditionally. But I think, we need to get to that stage before getting a whole lot of feedback, because the consultants are basically doing what they need for compliance at this point.
And just sort of to clarify on the consultants, is it consulting engineers, commissioning agents, who is doing this work?
Right, so they're doing benchmarking, but many of them offer retro commissioning, energy auditing. I mean, groups like Bright Power, Stephen Winter Associates, and several others, who a lot of them actually would probably they appreciate the benchmarking business, but it's kind of a path to more of the energy services that they provide, which are much more complex and detailed.
And then other jurisdictions on the multifamily?
Sure, there's no doubt that benchmarking and transparency got its foothold in the commercial space, and I think that has a lot to do with the way those facilities are managed, the way that energy is tracked, the way that capital investment decisions are made. But I really see multifamily residential following a similar trajectory. Even a year and a half ago, when Chicago passed its policy, there was a lot of discussion about whether to include residential the same way as commercial and municipal buildings, and ultimately those buildings were included. Since then, even, I think the discussion in other U.S. cities has changed. Philadelphia, which originally passed an ordinance that only covered commercial and municipal buildings, their city council just unanimously approved extending it to include residential buildings. So multifamily residential, I think, is later to the party for lots of reasons, but I think that they're definitely joining this trend. And when you look at the facilities themselves, sure there are differences in ownership structures and decision-making structures, but many of the buildings have similar systems, similar energy opportunities. Certainly in Chicago, we think residents should be able to participate in the cost savings that result from energy efficiency as much as our corporate tenants and occupants. So we see residential as very much a part of this trend.
Great. Okay, before we go back to the audience, well, we are going to go back to the audience just for one last question here, and then we'll let Boma wrap it up. But before I let you guys off the stage, and I want you, for those of you who aren't going to be answering this next question, to be contemplating this last one, so it can be like just Class A, the best response you've ever given to any question, ever. You have the opportunity here to give some feedback, some direction, something, you wish for those of you who come from jurisdictions that have energy reporting and benchmarking initiatives. What do you wish that somebody had told you, and what guidance do you have for our colleagues at the province and at the city in designing this policy moving forward over the next couple of months? So I'll let you just kind of think on that for a moment, or just put together that best response ever. You will be graded individually by me. But we'll go one last question here from the audience.
Thank you very much. It's actually a very similar, related question, bigger picture question. Why do you think cities, in your case in the States, took the leadership role in creating these ordinances or bylaws rather than states? And based on that, are there any lessons or advice you could give to Toronto and Ontario around that, whether it should be Toronto taking the lead, Ontario, a mixture? What are your thoughts on all that?
We're going to combine that with my final question there, so you guys just...
Combination, okay.
All right, grading begins now.
Okay, so for your question, I think that New York State, the NYSERDA actually really was and has been working on energy efficiency. I think that in terms of benchmarking and building energy efficiency laws on the city level, it was led largely by strong mayoral commitment to climate change mitigation, where the federal government was faltering. And it was part of really a movement of mayors, I guess, to address climate change in place of federal inaction. And so I think that basically gets at what you're asking, right, is what drove them to make that. And I think it was also within the group. So, I mean, forming the Office of Sustainability was, I think, a pretty big first. If not the first, it was monumental, at least for New York City. And there were a lot of very smart people within that group who were able to identify the opportunity early on in the building sector. And then put together a suite of programs, not just benchmarking, but others, to get at energy efficiency. And so the question around what maybe we wish someone could have told us earlier on, I think that data quality is the issue. I mean, I think, benchmarking is about understanding what's happening in your buildings, and you want to be able to make reliable decisions based on that data. And so that's why I'm particularly interested in Chicago's approach. I think there are probably a set of approaches. One, concern of mine is, and actually, Jamie, I don't know if you have information on this, but I'd be interested to hear it if you do, around costs associated with verification of benchmarking data, because, New York City, there's a lot of buildings submitting that data, and we're actually, looking to lower the threshold potentially to 25,000 square feet, which means including a lot of buildings with fewer resources and less experience. So, finding a way to ensure data quality, I think, is really important, and finding a way to do it cost effectively is similarly important. But so, yeah, I would say focus on data quality and ensuring that what you're getting back is reliable.
Maybe have a more clear internal process, perhaps, too, based on your original...
Well, yeah, that's definitely a part of it. I mean, I think that goes into it, absolutely, but the utility side of it goes into it as well. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do to improve data quality. Having a utility partner that, like in Seattle or Chicago or Philadelphia, that's really engaged, and that goes a long way. Tools like in Portfolio Manager that help the user check their own submissions, proactive measures on part of government before the reporting deadline, getting back to individual building owners, saying this submission doesn't look, maybe this is wrong. We want you to maybe consider this again. But then also just making it part of compliance or requiring some verification, like in Chicago's case. I mean, I think there are a lot of avenues, and determining which is most cost-effective and just most effective is important.
Great. Let's go next with Brad. We'll move across in terms of what are your final thoughts in terms of advice for the province and the city?
Thank you. Couple of the things that we experienced in the 3.5 years that we've been doing this is, number one, I think we seriously underestimated the data challenge. So going back to some comments that have already been made, it's not just collecting the data, it's defining what data you want to collect, how often you're going to report it, and also having a process to cleanse it. Because as we were getting into this, we were very fortunate to have the MMM group do an audit on any submissions that came in. And what we were shocked at is that somewhere between 30 and 40% of the submissions that we got, and remember this is a voluntary program, voluntary reporting, we weren't able to count because of some of the challenges with the way that the data was submitted. We actually think that we would be above our goal if we had all of the data submitted and were able to keep it in. I think the other thing, and we've talked a little bit about it before, is recognizing that there's going to be a significant difference between, call it the top 10 landlords in Canada and many of the other landlords, because they're just not going to have the wherewithal to be able to dedicate the time, energy, and resources necessary to do a really good job of reporting. And that's it's not an indictment or a criticism, it's really more a practical matter. And then the last thing I'll say is don't underestimate the amount of communication that needs to happen on this kind of initiative, to help people understand what it is and why it's being done, because I think people can perceive it as a burden as opposed to an opportunity. And I think there's a great communications opportunity to get out there, and we've heard from our panelists today to talk about that it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to learn more about your portfolio. It's an opportunity for you to engage in more energy conservation initiatives that are not just good for society and that tick in the box on the sustainability report, but also ones that actually do generate non-trivial savings.
So the first thing that I think I'd say is training about 4 people in the details of portfolio manager rather than training our entire property management team makes a whole lot of sense. We have like 4 gurus dispersed among 60 million square feet, and they're able to oversee the process and do some QA, QC, and we're able to fill in and maintain the data using our entry-level staff, and I think that helps make it a lighter lift for the company. Secondly, I think we've really seen that keeping a scoreboard, people play differently, and our property managers are compelled to search for those low-hanging fruits that remain and then go after the next highest fruits. And I think that's really been great. And those are the 2 points I'd like to make. Lastly, or actually, I have one third point. I wish somebody had told us that by supporting these ordinances, we were doing the right thing at the time, because we haven't seen any sort of punitive use of the data, and we've seen that municipalities like New York, we don't have any property in Chicago, but properties like New York, San Francisco, DC, and Boston, they get it. They understand that a high-performance data center or high-density trading floor isn't going to have the same energy use intensity as a sleepy office in the suburbs. So I appreciate that they understand those nuances, and we weren't certain that they did, and we thought that we might have a scorecard or some sort of A through F rating system rolled out immediately following these. And I think the cities are really taking their time studying the data that's coming in and looking at it closely without trying to take any next steps that affect the market incorrectly.
So there were a few parallel threads running. Quickly to the question on states and provinces versus cities. Taking a step back from Chicago for a moment, C40 focuses on cities because our organization, made up of those 71 cities, think that cities have really a special role to play in addressing climate, particularly when it comes to big building energy use. People are predominantly in cities, more than half of the world's population. GDP is concentrated in cities. Cities are the source of quite a large share of the GHG emissions. And because buildings are physical places, it can be easier for local governments, just as local governments tend to enforce the energy code or the safety code in buildings. The jurisdiction that's closest to buildings in this case may be initially best able to implement. But that said, again, I really commend the collaboration between the city and the province here. And I think that Toronto and Ontario could actually be the first model I'm aware of in North America of a city and a broader jurisdiction working together to put a broader policy framework in place. In the states, California and Washington state both have state policies, but they haven't really been implemented the same way as the city ordinances. So this is a chance to write that chapter of benchmarking policy. Quickly on the verification costs, I love the fact that Ben put up on screen the cost breakdown for the Boston Properties buildings. Chicago's data verification, because we recognize in-house or third-party verifiers, the cost breakdown might look identical, except in cases where buildings don't have a trained, recognized professional on staff, and they would go out and have to hire an engineer or another professional, probably at an hourly rate, to review that data. But again, one of the goals of data verification in Chicago was to encourage buildings to train up their own staff. There's really an upskilling 21st century job, energy efficient building operations, not only when it's time to verify your energy benchmarking data, but all the time. That's at play in Chicago. So there could be an incremental cost of an hourly rate, whatever it takes for an engineer to review the data. But that's not really the primary goal in Chicago. And then finally, to come around to the big wrap up and advice, and I'm reluctant to do this because C40 doesn't really advocate. What we do is get behind great ideas and help cities, in this case the province, to do more, better, faster. And I think that by virtue of the makeup of the room, so many partners are really kind of working in that same spirit. But that said, it's easy to get stuck in the clouds on benchmarking and transparency and to get lost in all of the different examples and the nuances in the 10 markets. When it comes down to it, benchmarking policy consists of probably 8 to 12 key decisions. And they deal with scope, what sectors are covered. They deal with size, what size buildings are covered. And when. I think phasing is really important in designing an effective ordinance. I think bringing the right people to the table, having the enablers in place, like utility data, like private sector support for training, outreach, communications. In the case of Chicago, we offer pro bono data verification for nonprofit buildings or buildings that really can't afford to bring in that engineer and don't have someone on staff. And there are decisions to be made about disclosure, when and how. Is it the first year's data? Is it the second year's data? Is it available to the public? Is it available on transaction? But really mapping out, what are those key decisions? Where would it make most sense for Toronto and for the province to fall on each of those levers? I mean, it can be a pretty rational exercise, and Chicago got to build on other cities' examples, and hopefully you'll take advantage of some of the case studies south of the border as you make the best decisions for Toronto's real estate market. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, when we have a conversation like this for several hours about benchmarking and transparency, when we get into the details of source CUI versus site or kilowatt hours versus BTUs, it's easy to forget that this isn't actually about benchmarking. This is about improving energy efficiency. It's saving energy, saving money, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Benchmarking is not an end in itself. It's only as good as the action it inspires. And we rightly have focused on some of the upfront pieces in designing effective benchmarking legislation. But the real challenge and the real opportunity and the real payoff is what we do with this data to help buildings make smart, cost-effective investments.
Great, thanks. Michael, bring it home with your sage-like advice.
Okay, I'm going to go right back to the top on this one. So we're at 400 parts per million CO2 and climbing. Pre-industrial revolution baseline is 280. This will get a lot more, this environment will get a lot more severe the next 5 or 10 years than it is today. People are shocked that I got to disclose my data. We are just starting down this path. Energy management has and will increasingly be a core skill of building owners. And you need to accept that reality. In Ontario, well, everywhere in the world, The sea change is that utilities have decided we cannot keep pumping power to you and your building for you to use an unlimited amount. That is why in the UK, if you're an E and an F building, you know what? You won't be able to lease it after 2019. Why would they be so tough on landlords? Because they're an energy importing nation, and they cannot afford to keep generating electricity for you to use to leave the lights on all night anymore. Same in Ontario. We cannot afford to keep refurbishing nuclear plants so that we can keep lights on all night in these buildings. There's a sea change that has happened. So a conservation program is 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Baseload nuclear is 13 or 14 cents. Do the math. No one's refurbishing Pickering D or E or whatever it is so that you can keep the lights. So this is happening all over the world. It will continue to happen across Canada. CO2 climbing, we've got to stop that. Cost of electricity supply is climbing, we've got to stop that. And so this will continue to grow. Get used to it.
Great. Well said, Michael. So I said I'd grade you all at the end, and I'm going to give you guys a solid 9.75. Nobody gets a 10, so it's great on a curve. So can you give a warm round of applause for our panelists tonight? They did an absolutely fantastic job. I learned a ton. And so I would like to now invite our sponsors, who you guys can get down if you like, and Michael, I know you have to sneak out if you wanted to take off as well. I'd like to invite our sponsor up. So, a real key partner moving this entire agenda forward will be BOMA. Our Toronto is lucky to have a very progressive real estate market, and a lot of the buildings that will be directly affected by this ordinance and the keys to success reside in our partner. We really want to thank them again very much this morning for hosting all of our fantastic panelists and for welcoming you and all of you to sit and learn from their experiences. So if we could have BOMA, do you want me to one more forward? Uh-oh, did I lose the PowerPoint presentation? One more. Concluding remarks? Oh. There you go. No PowerPoint? No, okay, great. Rachel, sorry.
So on behalf of BOMA, we have Keith Major, Senior Vice President, Property Management at Bentall Kennedy. Keith has over 25 years of experience in commercial real estate development, operations, and management. His current responsibilities at Bentall Kennedy include overseeing the development, management, and operations for Ontario's office and industrial portfolios.
Thanks, Rachel. On behalf of BOMA, I certainly congratulate everyone for putting this benchmarking best practices on. I think it's a fabulous opportunity for all of us to learn from others who've gone before us. When somebody asked why cities should be doing this, I think, if the City of Toronto is going to continue to show leadership, they need to be part of it, and they don't need to follow it. They need to be participating in it, embracing it, and learning from some of our peers. I think cities compete city to city on a global basis. It's not about states competing against states. Ultimately, we have to compete against cities around the world. So, I think we can be part of the solution. I think the key to all of this is collaboration. Certainly applaud the City of Toronto and the province for being very collaborative with BOMA, REALpac, and various other industry associations. I think we've come a long ways. And certainly we continue to encourage that dialogue as we move forward, because I think it's through that dialogue that we develop a shared vision and a shared plan that all of us feel good about at the end of the day, and we can all feel proud to be able to move forward onto the next steps. Just thinking back a little bit about market transformations, I think back to sort of 2005, 2004, maybe even starting out with BOMA Best or its predecessor, I think it was Green Globes, Go Green, and then got rebranded. Then we came out with the REALpac 20 by 15, very bold statement. I can remember sitting in my office going, there's not a chance. It'll never happen. But you know what? People get smart about these things, and you start thinking about it, and you start benchmarking yourself, and you're absolutely right. If you start to measure it, and you start to keep score, you're playing a little bit differently. So, hopefully all of us learn a little bit from this. I think, speaking on behalf of the larger landlords, I think many of us are already there. Certainly I was chatting in the back with one of my colleagues from Oxford. They're benchmarking all their buildings, have been for years. We have as well. Cadillac Fairview is probably in the same position. So I think the real challenge is going to be to help embrace and bring forward some of the mid-sized and smaller landlords to try and help them be part of it as well, because they are a part of the solution. It's not just the big landlords. So with that, I'd just like to draw a conclusion to this morning. I think it was a fabulous event, and certainly encourage the dialogue to continue between the city and the province and the real estate industry in general. Thanks again.
All right. One last final announcement for you. So these are when the ERB policy workshops are coming up. So, when we talked about, what are those 8 core components of an energy reporting and benchmarking strategy, this is actually will be your opportunity to dive into those details. There'll be facilitated workshops happening in 2 weeks. So hands up if you're planning on attending the energy policy workshop. There you go. Great to see you there. And then please contact those of our project managers at the back also too if you want to stay abreast of what's happening. So thanks again to all of you for attending. It was a great morning.